Thank you all for joining us. My name is Katherine Johns, and I am one of the specialists from the Greensboro History Museum in the Education Department. We are so grateful to be hosting tonight's last installment of our Grassroots to Government webinar. Every Tuesday in April, we have collaborated with the City of Greensboro Human Rights Department. We want to thank them sincerely for allowing us to look into the inner workings of this highly impactful department and all of the meaningful work that they have done and will continue to do. Today's conversation is made possible in part by the Greensboro History Museum, Inc., the City of Greensboro, and the Libraries Department. Any views, findings, or recommendations expressed in today's program do not necessarily reflect those aforementioned entities. We are also extremely pleased to have our guest audience join us. If you will take the time to view the bottom of your screen, you will see the Q&A icon. By selecting this option, you can type in questions for our panelists. Once you've typed in your question, hit the enter button on your keyboard to submit it. We have the latter part of the program reserved to field questions today. This evening, we welcome our panelists for today's webinar, which will also be featured as an archive on our History Museum YouTube channel that will premiere at 5:30 p.m. tomorrow. After that time and at your convenience, please visit www.greensborohistory.org and select the YouTube icon at the top of our website page. On tonight's program, we will discuss the Transgender Task Force, an entity of the City of Greensboro Human Rights Department. We have assembled a great panel to help inform us and field questions. Tonight's moderator is Dr. Love Jones, the director of the Human Rights Department. Among countless other things, Dr. Jones has served as an academic life coach, facilitated training on social justice, family services therapist, and a member of the National Association of Human Rights Workers. We are so very pleased to have Dr. Jones moderate our discussion along with her colleagues. So please welcome Dr. Love Jones as our moderator today.
Thank you so much, Katherine, and good evening, everyone. As always, it's a pleasure for the Human Rights Department to be represented in this collaboration in this series from Grassroots to Government, which is taking a closer look at what it means for community members to galvanize in order to address issues of marginalization, issues of discrimination, issues of mistreatment, and how these organized bodies have really gained ground, gained traction when it comes to advocating for the rights of all humanity. In the previous weeks, we have explored topics such as meeting the needs of justice-served populations, international communities. Last week, we took a closer look at the development of a newer body, the Ad Hoc Committee for African American Disparity. This week, we are taking a closer examination, taking a closer look at the development of the Transgender Task Force, a very recently developed body designed to examine barriers and marginalization, issues of maltreatment for transgender populations in the community. Tonight, we are joined by Cassius Slade as well as Jamal Anderson, who are both newly welcomed members to the Transgender Task Force. Thank you so much for being with us on this evening. And again, the focus of these conversations is to look at how members of the community, as well as city leadership, partner in order to look more deeply at issues of marginalization, in order to address them and eradicate them so that no one has to navigate Greensboro feeling a sense of maltreatment or any sense of discrimination. It is illegal, and it is important for our community to understand how the community takes ownership of human rights work, just as much as city representation by way of staff or city council members or city management. So again, thank you both to Cassius and Jamal. I'm going to first invite both of you to further introduce yourselves just a little bit. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Jamal, I'll start with you, and then I will then reference Cassius for you all to just share a little bit about yourselves.
Hey, my name is Jamal Anderson. My pronouns are he and him. I am affiliated with Fifth Avenue Alliance, which is a LGBTQ organization, and I'm also an organizational CEO and founder of my own organization called Next to Be's a Path, which we do public safety for our LGBTQ community.
Thank you, Jamal.
All right, hello. My name is Cassius L. Slade. I'm a 26-year-old transgender man, originally from Burlington, North Carolina, and my pronouns are he, him, his. I've worked primarily as an early childhood educator, and my activism has mostly been focused around student-led organizations when I was in school in Charlotte, as well as disability self-advocacy after my schooling.
Again, thank you both for being present on this evening. The first question that I want to ask is very much so for those who are in the learner seat who are not a part of transgender communities to gain a better understanding of some of the barriers, some of the challenges or obstacles that are faced by transgender populations. So if you could both talk a little bit about what some of the obstacles or human rights barriers are that exist for transgender populations.
You want go ahead, Cass?
Yeah, okay. So transgender populations here, as we know them, experience a lack of legal protections, stigma, harassment, and discrimination based on gender identity and presentation. Most transgender people do live under threat of violence. Hiring discrimination is a significant factor that really impacts transgender people's ability to find work. A lot of us are impoverished and lack comprehensive medical access. Many people I've known and live with are uninsured, unable to start or continue their transitions, as well as receive primary care, vision, or dental care. It's a real crisis among trans people, just the health alone. And really these compounding factors of discrimination, lack of legal protection, and poverty, as well as not having much medical access, leads to a very high suicide rate. Mental health is a really important thing for me, just because of what I've experienced as a transgender person and being in this community.
Some of the disparities and obstacles as a trans male myself and a trans male experience, it has to do with food insecurities, homelessness. I believe Cash just named them all. But violence, the harassment, it's a whole bunch of issues that are going on within mental health. Is mainly the top of the hill for our trans individuals and trans brethren and sisters within our community. So for me, I'll say personally, it has to do with the health wise. A lot of us don't have health insurance, although I do have health insurance, but others that I do know within our community are lacking the health insurance and mental support.
So these are basic things that every human being needs in order to really be able to thrive and function. You're suggesting are some of the obstacles, like actually confronting denial of these basic things like food, shelter, to be physically safe. These are a lot of the obstacles that even other marginalized populations may have access to. The uniqueness of transgender experience means that even the way in which those rights are denied, would you say there's a uniqueness even to that?
Oh yeah, of course. There's definitely a uniqueness to all of it, which combines into, the mental for majority of us.
And for most people do experience intersections of being trans and being a person of color, being trans and being disabled, all sorts of different, like, I guess,
Cultures.
cultures and
Yeah.
intersections of identity and discrimination. It is sort of intensified by you being transgender. So you're poor, it's very difficult to start over from the beginning. It's going to be much harder for you as a transgender person, especially if you don't pass, if you're gender nonconforming visibly, to find work, to feed yourself and have a place to lay your head down at night.
So that kind of brings us to the existence of a transgender task force. You've talked about several human rights that have automatically been violated based on gender identity and expression, which, as outlined by the Civil Rights Act, according to those 7 protected classes, which have recently been expanded to include gender identity, is literally against the law at the federal level and translates at every other level. So with all of these barriers that and prejudices that are actually defined as illegal, why is it so important to have a task force that is focused on the human rights violations of transgender communities?
I got it. So I think that it's important to have this task force, namely just to bring visibility and voices to the table, because we're such a large, and even though we're legally protected, that doesn't mean we're culturally protected. I do think that shining a light on such a large, unprotected, and vulnerable population will always help us.
I was just gonna say this, just about the same thing of Cass shining the light on our LGBTQ members and trans individuals are very imperative for the community. It'll help myself and other community members and leaders to have that support for city officials and government to support us during our disparities.
Oh, I apologize.
No, you're fine, Dr.
Okay. So I heard you, Cassius, say something that I think kind of transcends all human rights work, which is that it's not that it's not that there aren't legalities on the books that suggest how people should be treated, but it's the pervasiveness with which people can be mistreated, though it is illegal.
Right.
And, you know, any of the vulnerable populations that worked to start volunteer bodies like Transgender Task Force, African American Ad Hoc Committee for African American Disparity, et cetera, it's not for a lack of policy on the books that would substantiate some basic level of protections, but it's that culturally, if you get a pass in not obeying those laws and not abiding by those laws, then that is what creates a different level of vulnerability. Is that safe to say?
I think that's true. And I think that, a force like this does set a good precedent, especially for the city of Greensboro and its future relationship with its transgender residents.
Jamal, were you getting ready to say something? I want to be.
Yeah, I wanted to just double back because a lot of people aren't passable. And, you know, our trans community, you know, I'm very passable. So you would never know who I am, or even if I'm trans, you would never know unless I disclosed, that I was trans. So a lot of us aren't passable. So that's very something to very important to discuss about the passing and not passing in our gender nonconforming community.
So would it be safe to say that one thing that the community could learn, that the general, community that is Greensboro could learn, is that there are multiple understandings and perspectives and realities of transgender communities. It's not just all lumped into one population, but there are various experiences within transgender communities. Is that safe to say?
Right, right.
Yeah. And so in that, one of the things that to give some back history, much like some of the other bodies that have been developed, whether it's Human Rights Commission that is well over 50 years old in comparison to ACAD and Transgender Task Force, which are quite new, all of them are usually supported by a liaison from the city council. So in the conversations that we've had about other bodies that have been mentioned, the Human Rights Commission, Commission for the Status of Women, IAC, International Advisory Committee, Mary Kay Abuzawader is the direct liaison for those bodies. For ACAD, or Ad Hoc Committee for African American Disparity, it's Sharon Hightower. For Transgender Task Force, the council member who has been very much so connected from the very beginning and is the designated liaison is Michelle Kennedy, who identifies as a part of the LGBTQ community. Can you talk a little bit about how important it is for government to see the representation of government to see a need or a gap when it comes to the rights being sustained by transgender communities, and then getting behind that? Like, how valuable is that? What does that mean to you? And how necessary do you think it is?
Well, I'll just say that it's very necessary, because it'll definitely address the necessary discrimination on the LGBTQ communities and trans communities. So it'll really much kind of just well, I won't say kind of, it'll definitely address some of the concerns within the trans community and LGBT communities.
I think that some of the best help I've ever gotten was from people who directly asked me what I needed. So I'm a big fan of self-advocacy when it comes to shaping policy, shaping culture. And I think that having a program that reaches out to transgender people who live here is a big and important step.
One of the things that is vital to any sort of volunteer body is that the membership is able to take ownership of the work. While there may be staff members who are designated to provide support, like the members of the Human Rights Department, or there may be a council person like Councilwoman Kennedy, who is very vested in making sure that you have adequate support. At the end of the day, it is the work of the body that creates momentum as far as really nailing down areas where vulnerable populations need their rights sustained, and in some instances even, restored, depending upon the topic that's on the table. So can you all talk a little bit about the work that you envision doing? And I understand that you're only 2 members of an entire task force, so I'm not asking you to speak on behalf of every member, but just some things that are of particular importance to you that you would like to maybe address on a deeper level as a part of the task force work.
Well, for me, it's getting more support of that security for all of us, especially as trans individuals. We don't have any support, and probably worldly, there isn't any support for us. So having organizations like myself and city officials take part in a trans task force, or forming other entities for some type of trans task force, will be very supportive for everyone globally.
Can you talk about security a little bit more? I know that you're deeply entrenched in it, but for those who, are just tuning in and might not understand how critical the issue is around security for trans populations and what context it is. I'm sorry, there was a mosquito flying towards my face. But what in particular, like what kinds of contexts are you referring to when you talk about security?
Oh, when I'm talking about security, I'm talking about the trans women. You know, there's been countless of murders of trans women, and a lot of us don't even talk about the assault and battery that some trans men are experiencing in relationships. So a lot of that has to do with, you know, just people being people and not getting the mental health support to be a partner in their relationship. So for me, it is addressing the safety of all of our LGBT and trans communities.
So does that also refer to interfacing when like in domestic violence cases, when public safety is called upon, and does that include the security that you're speaking of, or the safety and protections and how to feel safest and most protected? Is that part of it?
It's that, and it's more or less of just, I guess, every day as well. For all of us, it is everyday activities, because there is no type. Go ahead, Cass.
Oh yeah, sorry. I just wanted to, to add to that, the discussion about security, that for the most part, especially people of color and disabled trans people, even here in Greensboro, we rely on informal networks of support. So relationships, you might know someone who has a place for you. And sometimes your living situation isn't safe and you have to go now. A lot of trans people have unfortunately experienced that, as well as other insecurities like food insecurity and housing insecurity. But having to rely on these informal networks does open you up to abuse of basically any scale. So having a more legal, dedicated framework and direct intervention in the lives of transgender people, so providing food, housing, money, medication, shelter, does stand as a priority for me in my activism in general, simply because I know due to cultural discrimination, most of us are impoverished and live in insecure situations.
That brings up a question about housing insecurity or food insecurity. So just to give a glimpse, understanding that any example is not the example across the board for all transgender populations, right? Because we don't want to ever have a description of an experience that then becomes a generalization. But can you give examples of how food insecurity and housing insecurity happens for transgender populations, especially? I know that there is a huge disparity for youth who find themselves both food and housing insecure. How does that happen?
A lot of people are put out by their friends or excommunicated from their religious communities, their family. You lose, maybe I've heard the statistic, maybe 70% of the people in your life don't support you after you come out as transgender. It's a very highly stigmatized position to be in, and it leaves you vulnerable. Mm-hmm. Sometimes people end up on the streets. Many people turn to sex work for survival. It is an unfortunate truth that, if you don't look gender nonconforming, you're at pretty high risk of danger in public spaces, in your home, and just being deprived of resources in such an immediate way because you've decided to come out as transgender does make it harder to start over. It makes it hard to get back on your feet. It feels like you're being knocked back down over and over again. You know, you go to a job interview and they notice the difference between your presentation and your legal documentation, and you won't get your job. So you have no place to, you can't pay rent, you can't pay for food. You might have to rely on someone. I've seen people end up in very abusive relationships simply so they could have a place to rest. And this is a, you know, unfortunate reality of survival when you're deprived of resources entirely, just on the basis of your gender identity.
Yeah, I was going to piggyback off Cass. A lot of it has to do with mainly our gender marker, because some of us that are gender non-conforming and conforming individuals, some of us don't have our gender marker changed, and some of us do, but majority of us don't have that done. So a lot of the discrimination starts with that gender marker, and then it trickles down to homelessness and sex work, abusive relationships, just pretty much all of it combined.
So if you had the ability to really speak to communities about best practices, because, you know, many times in any area of human rights work, right, whatever vulnerable population, when we hear about the disparities, especially if you're not directly impacted, meaning that you're not a part of the community that you're helping, you don't directly identify with the community that you're helping, then you make a lot of assumptions about, you know, what is important and how to best help, or how to address the issues of human rights, et cetera. And in any instance, you'll hear from directed impacted populations, whether it's immigrant and refugee communities, the needs of women, the needs of, you know, African-American populations based on their history in this country. They will very much say that there's a lot to learn before you project how to be helpful. Would you say that that is true of transgender communities as well?
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, yes. I do think that probably the best thing for people trying to learn about transgender issues to do to educate themselves, the literature won't cover it all. You should meet some transgender people, come to spaces like this, just involve us in your lives, because we're all over the place, and some of us pass and look cisgender, some of us don't. Some people's presentation, like mine, changes from whatever way the wind blows, but not everybody is like that. And just showing that we're not a static group, that we're people just like you, that there are thousands of personalities, genders affected by culture and religion and upbringing. I do think that the best thing people can do to educate themselves is to get to know the trans people in their community.
I think for anyone to try to experience the LGBT, try to attend like an event that is trans led. There's several organizations that within North Carolina and the southern areas, southeast, that are more or less yearly, but due to COVID, some of those events have stopped. But it's very important for you all to attend an LGBT event, or just to get some type of understanding of local LGBT or trans led organizations.
So it's about understanding and observing experience. Sometimes when people say that there are vulnerabilities, it's hard for a person who's not directly impacted, no matter which population, to wrap their minds around what those vulnerabilities, may look like. I believe, Jamal, in a conversation that you and I had, you also talked about events and public demonstrations, just the potential compromise of safety, even in those spaces, where, you might have security hired and things like that, but just that you really don't understand how physically vulnerable transgender communities are until you observe when they're assembled, and the way in which security becomes altogether necessary in order to protect their safety. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I think that to the naked eye, it's like, well, of course, people are safe in any kind of demonstration as long as you put in your request to demonstrate, and then, police presence is there and security is there. What makes it a little more unique, do you think, when it comes to those kinds of safeties and protections for transgender populations?
Well, the uniqueness is that we're both trans men and women. We're both, the same sex. So those disparities, that starts with mainly really like even a search. Mm-hmm. If a police officer would search any of us, you would find parts that you shouldn't be finding. So that's another issue. And of course they would, mark us as male or female, which is not really, you shouldn't be doing that either. But of course, due to their ignorance, they don't understand, the gender roles and the orientation. But when it comes to the safety role, a lot of us really, really, really need to have that protection.
Mm.
Oh, yeah.
There, just to familiarize everyone who may be, tuning in, the purpose of the Transgender Task Force is to directly address issues of disparity and the legal violation of rights of transgender populations based on our Civil Rights Act, with expanded protections now that includes sexual identity and sexual presentation, which then covers transgender communities. And so this task force is committed to examining closely policies, processes, and procedures that, while on their face, may not appear to violate transgender communities, by way of disparate impact, by way of the overarching application of a rule, a process, or a procedure that then creates a greater level of vulnerability and the denial of access to basic things that people need. That is part of the itinerary or part of the agenda of the Transgender Task Force. So before we move towards questions that may be coming in, the last question before that I want to ask is, what is it that motivated you specifically to join the task force? Like, why was it important to you to do work as a task force member?
Well, for me, again, due to me still doing the security work that I do pretty much monitoring of my own community. So a lot of that, is the safety for me and the safety of our trans community.
See, the pandemic impacted us all, but it really, I really saw how it hit particularly underserved communities, people who are already impoverished, transgender people, disabled people. I spent all of quarantine in a house with, not a large one, with 3 other transgender people, all suffering from various disabilities, mostly supporting us financially through crowdfunding, informal networks of support and favors. I'm an Alamance native, and I haven't lived in the area in a long time, but I relocated here specifically because it was more affordable and closer to my family, who came around after I came out as transgender after some years. I think that uplifting those like me and my family, I consider the people who I just spent a year indoors with, my family. I consider uplifting those with the least resources to be a part of uplifting the whole community. We all rise up from the bottom. Um, I think that I can help affect change in some way that would help the other trans people I know who live in Greensboro.
Well, I just want to say thank you to you both for actively, educating and sharing by way of sharing your individual experiences, and also talking a little bit more about the broader experience of different members of transgender communities here in Greensboro. And I want to stress that plural interpretation of communities, because again, among vulnerable populations, it's important for our communities to understand that there are multiple and competing definitions of an experience. And so much like there is not only one version of being African American, therefore there's a spectrum covered with the Ad Hoc Committee for African American Disparities, as well as a spectrum when it comes to the Commission on the Status of Women and exploring the experiences of women in the community, such as the case for transgender populations. And so again, thank you for speaking to variations of those experiences. I want to reference Katherine to ask if, and continue to invite people, if you have not already, to put any questions in the Q&A, but to also refer to Katherine to determine whether or not any questions have come forth at this time.
So we have not had any questions yet. So if people from our wonderful participants would like to add in a question now, this would definitely be the time. Oh, there we go. So we have a question from Jody Stanley, who is asking, you may have addressed this already, but how do you see intersectionality play out for trans community members?
See, for me personally, I'm an autistic adult, and a lot of the other people I spend time with are also autistic and also transgender. We kind of we kind of lump ourselves up together, not even intentionally, just because we get along best. It also means that like my immediate network, because we're all impacted in very similar ways, we don't have a lot of resources. We're all trading the same $5 back between each other just to stay afloat sometimes. But of course, there's variation. So one of my best friends is a Black trans woman who's autistic, and she lives a different experience from me. Some of the women in my immediate friend group, my partner and family members, I do observe just intersectionality changing, like even one difference changing your whole experience as a transgender person, as an impoverished person, as a disabled person or person of color, just sends it kind of spinning, I don't know, wildly off into new forms of discrimination. You could experience different sets of challenges and problems that it's very hard to address in a small group, when nobody has any money. Just every intersection creates a fully different spectrum experience.
Well, for me, I articulate with the trans community as, of course, me being a trans male within my community, and a trans community leader for the safety of our LGBT and trans community. A lot of the things that I do on the side are mainly a a lot of artwork I do and some music, but I also like to make like my candles and things of that nature, shea butters and stuff like that,
I'll have to try
drawing.
that.
Yeah, shea butters is good. Um, Incense and stuff. So that's kind of what I do, you know, privately throughout my personal life, but it also articulates as me being who I am as an individual.
Thank you both for sharing that. Does anybody else have questions at this time for our participants? You can pop it into the Q&A or the chat.
While those questions are coming in, I did think of another question that I think is valuable. When it is called to question how a policy needs to be examined because maybe it has some discriminatory elements, or a procedure that has some discriminatory elements to it, do you feel as if there is enough attention put on policy examination and policy research? And do you hope to bring that to the Transgender Task Force?
Well, for me, go ahead, Cass.
Oh, sorry. While I don't know a lot about policymaking personally, I am a big fan of the phrase practice makes perfect. I would hope that there's a system to amend policy that doesn't match up with reality or that isn't enforced in an effective way. Just as a general rule.
Okay. Jamal, you were gonna?
Yeah, I was definitely going to say, I don't know too much about policy, but if within a whole, if discrimination is not being talked about, or anything about like the trans community, excuse me, is not being discussed, that's definitely a red flag for me. And I, you know, somewhat will kind of just address it with some of the community leaders to see if we can address it.
Well, again, I really want to offer that you sharing your motivations and your commitments to this task force and what you hope to glean from it, I'm sure is very thought-provoking for community members, because I think that, again, when you're not directly impacted by something, your assumption is that it's very much, you know, personal and over there, wherever there is, you know, regardless of what vulnerable populations you're talking about. And sometimes it is valuable to hear where we have violations of the law and violations of protections and how that directly impacts different populations. I think that's really critical, because many times we assume that it's not just about, you know, really looking at those core practices, those core policies and procedures that really do sometimes create disparity. And we're very unaware of what it means for certain vulnerable communities to be without food, to be without clothing, to be without shelter, to be physically vulnerable, to not be able to access healthcare under any circumstances, to have to do things like crowdfunding in order to stay alive, and or sex work, wherever, you know, one's interpretation is of that on a spectrum. You know, all of these things are very much so connected to the lived experience of transgender communities literally trying to just stay alive. And so I think that conversations like this become all the more important, so that people can be well educated about where the barriers are and how to eradicate them in order to create a safer experience, a physically, mentally, and emotionally safer experience for a person who's a part of the Greensboro community, regardless of how they identify sexually or racially or by way of ethnic origin or any of the work of the volunteer bodies that are supported by the Human Rights Department.
I have a question here from, I apologize if I say your name wrong, Aisha Pons. And their question is, what are some of the barriers or challenges that prohibit access to healthcare? The ACA, Medicaid, can they help? Is it primarily monetary?
In my opinion, most of the barriers I've seen people face to healthcare are monetary. So they don't just not have money for healthcare, they don't have money for food, for rent, they have next to nothing. I'm not the most familiar with the Affordable Care Act, but I have heard people, face challenges trying to get insurance, as well as there is the angle of that some people who should be on disability are not on disability for various reasons, either lack of access to documentation, not being able to hire someone to appeal your or to advocate for you or appeal your case, and also sort of along the recognition of invisible and mental illnesses and how they impact people. A lot of people who've experienced trauma, for example, might not be able to integrate into the workforce and have an income regularly. And a lot of transgender people do face violence, harassment, general, like just unacceptable human rights violations that have lasting health impacts. So I would say that it is primarily a monetary issue. That's it.
It's a major issue. The Medicaid system and the healthcare system here in the North Carolina is definitely not supportive of any surgeries or any type of therapy, even medication for trans individuals, which is crazy. But that's just North Carolina, and there are other cities and states, but the policy for Medicaid is definitely not supportive of any trans individuals.
We have a next question from Sharon Merton, which is, this is a bit more of a personal question. You mentioned the importance of mental health for transgendered individuals. What does it look like to address this? Therapy? Are there group gatherings?
I am a big advocate for talk therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy. Anything that can help someone manage the trauma of living day to day as a person who is, your very being is stigmatized. I do think that any form of therapy, making also psychiatry accessible, just because of the nature of neurological conditions in general, that sorry. And also, I guess, education on mental health should comprehensively be available to people.
Yeah, I would also say for mental health, to address the concerns with mental health is definitely, it could be physical, but actually seeing a therapist will be supportive for trans individuals as well. One of the first steps of even transitioning is to actually see a actual therapist or someone that deals with trans individuals to actually get your medication. So it's very important that you actually see a therapist in that stage. Well, our stages of transness.
Well, while we're rounding out the part about medical support and where that intersects with the safety in general, I have been informed at times that it's also about the bias of practitioners who are legally supposed to be unbiased in the way in which they apply medical practice and medical care, but that sometimes when interfacing with medical staff, that there's a different treatment that then also compromises the level of care that you receive, depending upon which practitioner you get and how their personal views may influence their work. Is that fair to say also?
Yes, I'll generally tell you guys a story. Well, not a story, but just something that happened to me. So might have been a month or so ago, I went to the doctor's office and the young lady said, she called my name, Jamal. So she said, okay, well, we're gonna take your blood pressure. I said, okay. And she just screamed out, are you taking testosterone? I said, yeah, but just kind of keeping it, private and not making it so broadly known to everybody, hey, this person is taking testosterone, although we were in the office, but it was still very loud.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
being discreet about your asking the patients.
Which is usually a standard practice, right?
It's a HIPAA law.
Right.
That being discreet when you interface with a patient and not violating that patient's rights by disclosing any sort of medical, anything that's associated with their medical records or anything like that. That's general practice and that's general expectation. I think many times when the conversation about human rights comes up, that what people forget is that the way in which one knows that a human rights violation has taken place is that when you look at other people who are similarly situated, who do not experience that barrier or who do not have negative interface, that is what speaks to the fact that this is breaking away from a standard. If the standard is that you do not discuss someone's medical history in a way that breaches confidentiality, then that is the case for everyone across the board. So those who are similarly situated should experience the same thing. What just came up in this example that Jamal gave is that if that is the standard, then how is it that I am not a part of the standard practice? Right. That is what a violation of one's rights is. It's when you have a standard way of preserving humankind and you decide to not preserve humankind under certain circumstances. That is one way of looking at the violation of human rights.
Oh yeah. There is a kind of funny but sad community term for a form of discrimination trans people face medically, which is called trans broken arm syndrome, which is when a doctor or other says they can't treat you or don't know how to treat your injury simply because you've been transitioning, you're on hormone replacement therapy. And it's been applied to so many ridiculous things that a doctor should be able to treat that it's referred to as trans broken arm syndrome. You can treat anyone's broken arm, but the biases that your medical practitioner has, this is like considered a funny joke, just an everyday thing for us, which is, why like it's hard to discuss it in a less flippant way. You have to be flippant and sort of laugh at your own pain and inconvenience.
Oh, Cash, you were breaking up. We couldn't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. What part did I leave off on?
But I think we made out what you said. I just want to get confirmation. You were saying that part of the coping mechanism is to kind of laugh at your own.
Yeah. your own pain,
Your own pain,
such that a term like trans broken arm syndrome even exists. It's ridiculous that it has to, but it does.
Well, I have learned a lot from you all today, and I so appreciate each of you for being here. Dr. Jones, do you have anything else that you wanted to share, or Jamal or Cassius?
Just thank you so much for supporting this conversation the whole month long, looking at the way in which community members really galvanize and engage in human rights work in partnership with the city. Thank you so much.
Well, we deeply appreciate being able to have you all. So I will start to close us out. Thank you all for joining us this evening's webinar. Tonight's webinar completes our From Grassroots to Government series, and thank you to Dr. Love Jones, who's been our wonderful moderator, to Cassius Slade and Jamal Anderson.
Here's the barking noise.
So cute. We are grateful for all of our previous panelists as well who have been helping us out this month and who have given their time and their expertise to lending words to our audiences that they can take away. Thank you to our audience for today. We couldn't do this without you. Please remember, if you wish to watch again or tell a friend, go to our Greensboro History Museum YouTube channel at greensborohistory.org, and then select the YouTube icon at the top or the bottom of the page. You can conduct a search directly from YouTube as well. You simply put in Greensboro History Museum. Thank you again to all.